Hello, and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, screenwriter and producer. We'll be talking about the show Tour of Duty, which was about the Vietnam War and ran from 1987 to 1990, a particular favorite of mine, but Brian has worked on a number of projects. He's the writer of Process to Product, From Concept to Script, a practical guide for the screenwriter, which is well regarded, has great reviews on Amazon, was published January 2019. So we'll get a little bit into screenwriting as well. But yeah, thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, sure. So since we're talking about Tour of Duty, let's go back in time and tell me how you got involved with that show.
Sure. So Tour of Duty, when it first started in 1987, one of the producers on the show, the associate producer, was a gentleman by the name of Vahan Musikian. And I had actually come out to Los Angeles about 10 years earlier, that's about 9 years earlier, 1978, to become an actor. And I was, that was my goal. And I was a struggling young actor, failing miserably. And Vahan Musikian, also being a producer, was also an actor. And we had an acting class together. And I was in a place where my girlfriend at the time was getting antsy about, when I was going to get a real job and marry her. And so I was talking to Vahan, and he said, I need somebody to help me with the show. Would you come on as my assistant in post-production? He was doing the post-production producing, and he needed someone to help him out. And I thought, well, a steady paycheck sounds good. I started with the show as his assistant. And by the end of the season, I was the post-production supervisor. The very next season, I became an associate producer. And the season after that, I wrote for the show. So I kind of made a little bit of a leap each year as we went forward. Mm-hmm. And I eventually married that woman, and we're still together. So.
That's excellent. Well done. Mission accomplished.
Thank you very much.
So one of the things I really liked about the show, is that it really tried to address, it wasn't a rah-rah show necessarily, though it did have its moments that, were at the right time, but it tried to deal with racism in the military, with drug abuse, with and at times making the enemy sympathetic, though not supportive of the enemy necessarily. It tried to look at both sides. Can you tell me, how did they, tell me about that approach to the show, what they wanted?
I want to kind of take you through, if I may, a little bit of the journey behind the curtain, because the show had kind of a schizophrenic personality over the 3 years that it was on the air. Mm-hmm. When it was first conceptualized, it was conceptualized by Steve Duncan and Travis Clark, Travis Clark and Steve Duncan. And they had brought the script and the story to the gentleman who was producing, Zeb Braun, the executive producer. Mm-hmm. And Zeb Braun brought on a writer-director named Bill Norton. Bill Norton rewrote the script entirely. And his concept was, we want to go and do a show about the guys in combat. There was a series in the 1950s and 60s called Combat. Mm-hmm. And he wanted it to be kind of a re-envisioning of that story, the idea of the heroic men are guys in the field. And that was the first season, and that did very well. It set the kind of the tone. Bill left the show, and in the second season, a gentleman came in, and his idea was a little bit different. He did not have a military background, and he didn't really want the show to follow in the footsteps of Combat. But unfortunately, he kind of took the tack that he wanted it to be, our guys suddenly were doing, like, there were hookers being murdered in Saigon, and they were going to investigate that. So he took it in a kind of a more television fantasy direction. Mm-hmm. And that went on in the second season. And the third season was when Steve Smith, who was a Vietnam veteran, who had written a book about his experiences, took over as the executive producer. And it was my favorite season of the show. Mm-hmm. And that was the season really when we got into some of the deeper questions about, you know, morality in war. I actually wrote an episode that was loosely based on the My Lai massacre, mm-hmm. where our guys at that season, our guys become members of SOG, the Special Operations Group. Mm-hmm. And they were put into the field to give support to a platoon, and they come upon a village that had been decimated. And there's one of a gentleman named in the script was Lieutenant Beller, who had actually been in charge of the platoon that murdered all these civilians. Mm-hmm. And it talked about, you know, how fear and paranoia and, you know, being constantly on guard, how that got into the people's minds and triggered them. And based on that, that's when we actually got into the drug use, because after seeing this kind of horrible event, one of our guys, Purcell, started smoking heroin-laced marijuana. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't let us have him shoot up. that was when the network drew the line there. Mm-hmm. But that was initially the idea, was that he was going to get hooked on heroin and opium. But we went to opium-laced marijuana. They were okay with that. Mm-hmm. So that's what we did. And that season, for me, was the one that took a real step toward really talking about what is it like, you know, in war? What are the people, you know, who are on the front lines dealing with? What are they battling against? You know, what's good, what's bad? You know, how do they move forward? We had that was the season that we brought on Carl Weathers, mm-hmm. And he had a racially mixed child, and we had episodes that dealt with that. We also had that season we had Lee Majors, the $6 Million Man, was on as kind of this crusty old soldier. Mm-hmm. And it was just, we really had a great time taking it back to the roots of what is really the experience of the soldier and talking about the guy's emotional life. Mm-hmm. And we hadn't really done that as much. A little bit in the first season, not so much in the second season. Then we really got back to it in the third season.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really like about the show is that, you know, obviously it's the one group of guys goes through a whole bunch of things that, you know, historically you probably wouldn't have seen one group go through all that, you know, but you bring it for dramatic purposes. You have the same characters people like going through all of this. Right. But I believe each episode opens with like some historical fact to establish the basis for that episode.
Right.
What sort of so one of the things I'm interested in is what historical consultants you had, because the war, depending on how you want to consider the ending of the war, it was 15 or 16 years between the end of the war and when this series started. What sort of historical consultants did you have, and also as far as, you know, sets and that sort of thing, how did you approach that, the nuts and bolts of making it as historical as possible?
Yeah, in the first season we had initially a full-time research assistant who was responsible for, you know, kind of guiding us on in terms of story source and what actually was happening at that time, you know, kind of moment to moment, day to day. I'm pretty sure that we began the series, we were like at 1966, 1967, mm-hmm. and went forward from there. And we went through the assassination of Martin Luther King and the death of Kennedy and, you know, Robert Kennedy. You know, so we had some kind of like timeline of what the major events in history were that were happening around the world. Mm-hmm. So the first season we had a researcher. The third season, we had someone from the DoD that was a consultant, and, you know, we ran everything by them. We'd say, you know, and usually, you know, they do all that they can to kind of allow you some creative, you know, freedom, but they'll also say to you, you know, that didn't happen and it couldn't happen. So, for instance, we were talking about, you know, when our guys became a SOG group, that you know, usually that wasn't the way that a platoon was formed. You know, that wasn't usually how the SOG groups came about. But in this case, they said, yeah, possibly it could happen like that. So once we got on, okay, yeah, maybe it could possibly happen like that, then we would take that on. And, you know, the Department of Defense was very instrumental in allowing us to kind of, you know, take the stories wherever we needed it to go. And we really kind of counted on them to help us keep it real and keep it believable and keep it honest. And that's, you know, we felt a great amount of, you know, duty to the troops, to the people that had served, and to make sure that, you know, we weren't, you know, in any way besmirching them, and that we were also, you know, paying homage to, you know, to the sacrifices that they had made. So that was always in the forefront of our mind. And like I said, when in the third season, Steve Smith, who had been on from the beginning, he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was also just an amazing resource. So, you know, we would have days where, you know, we go, hey, you know, not sure what we're doing, and you know, couldn't get I can't remember if he was a lieutenant or captain who our consultant was, but I have to look it up. But, you know, if we couldn't get a hold of him right away, we go to Steve and say, hey, Steve, you know, what would happen around here? What would do, you know, what under these circumstances, you know, what would you do? And he, you know, he knew so much about it because he had lived it, he had written about it, and he was just a really, really great guy to have around for that purpose, and also a terrific writer. And he went off to exec produce other shows after he did that. So, but that was how we kept, you know, that, and of course, every writer and everybody on the show did their own research. You know, would go through and, you know, try and figure out stories that they wanted to deal with. And I was, like I said, I was actually fortunate enough to bring the story of, you know, the drug abuse into the show, and to get into this kind of My Lai massacre situation and how that happened, and, you know, how it could be, you know, how people could end up in that situation and take those actions, and make it hopefully sympathetic and believable that these events happen to people in war.
I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, author of Process to Product, and also a producer and writer on the Vietnam War show Tour of Duty. You can find more information on Brian at brianherskowitz.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal, historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Do you know what kind of mail you got from vets?
Oh yeah, we got, you know, all kinds of supporting mail from people, and, you know, we would get things from guys, you know, talking about, you know, the experiences they had. And once in a while you get somebody who said, you know, that's not how it happened, and, you know, that's not real. But generally the support was really strong for the show. You know, it's just, I wish we had been able to have a longer run at it. And, you know, I think we were really finding our feet in the third season. I would love for it to go on for another 4 or 5 years. But I think that the veterans that came on and that talked to us, and, you know, the people that we met, I think they genuinely appreciated the show and genuinely thought that we captured what, you know, their experience was like with the, you know, obviously there's a television gloss over it. It's not, you know, it's not really war. It's war adjacent. So, you know, you have to keep that in mind. But I think we got really good support from people.
Now, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that the show had, you know, as they say, falling ratings in the third season, so it was canceled. But, you know, was it really losing interest, or is it more one of those things where it's just not in the right time slot and maybe there's other stuff going on, you know?
You know, it was a lot of different things. They had moved us around quite a bit, trying to find a place for the show to get an audience. And, you know, we were doing okay. We were actually either, you know, second, or, you know, sometimes we'd win our night. Sometimes we were second in the night. And and they look at that, but they also look at, overall numbers and the expense of the show, and, do they want to continue on with it? And I can't say exactly why they canceled the show. I do think our numbers were generally struggling. And one of the things that happened is we were on opposite often China Beach, which was another show about Vietnam in that same era.
Yeah.
And we were actually just kind of coincidentally almost in sync in terms of where we were historically. So, for instance, we did our show about, the assassination of Martin Luther King. The same week we did ours, China Beach came out with theirs. Now, we didn't talk to them about it. It wasn't like, hey, we're going to do a show like this. Why don't you do one too? In fact, if anything, would have been furthest from the truth. But that's how it happened. And we did a show about tunnel rats. About the guys that would go into the tunnels, and usually they're really small guys that were able to maneuver in the small tight spaces. And they did it too, but they had a much bigger budget. They had much more support from the network, and they were able to do everything a little bit bigger and a little bit more grandiose than us. Very much not nearly as, I think, accurate an experience. It was because it was really more about the hospital base and more about nurses and their involvement with the soldiers and that kind of thing. So we had very different purviews in terms of the show, but they had a lot more money. So like when we did a tunnel show, we were able to build 2 little pieces of tunnel. They had like 3 miles of tunnel. It was just, they had more money. So that was one of the things I think that really kind of bumped us, was that China Beach was doing better than us and was able to kind of garner a bigger audience. And I think they looked at it and went, well, that's the popular Vietnam show, so we're going to move on.
Now I'll say, China Beach, I'm not commenting on the quality, but when I was young, I never watched it. To me, it seemed like it was a soap opera, and whether that's the case or not, I don't even know, because I haven't watched it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if it was so much soap opera per se, but it was absolutely a show that was a television version of Vietnam, and it wasn't made for the troops. It was made to entertain an audience. We weren't really made for the troops either, but we were true to the experience, or at least we tried to be.
One of the things, the main guys in the show, and then the one female character in the show, I felt like, and I'm not asking about behind the scenes how they got along, but it felt like they were really interesting to watch. There was a good chemistry, at least on screen.
Yeah, absolutely. The characters, Terrence Knox, who played, was kind of the head honcho. He was Sergeant Anderson. He and Steve Caffrey, who was Lieutenant Goldman, they got along really well. And so did, in fact, everybody did. Miguel Nunez, Ramon Franco, and Stan Foster, and then there were some people that came on, like I think I mentioned, that we had Lee Majors, and we had Carl Weathers that came in for a little while, and the late John Dye, who was our medic for a while, Doc Hockenberry. Everybody, it was really, they really did get along very well, and they really did, care about each other and support each other. If there were problems that they were having on the set or behind the scenes, I didn't see it. I think in every show at some point somewhere, somebody's going to, get their hackles up about either a show or, somebody getting in their face. You never know. But I didn't see a whole lot of that.
So we were talking about sort of the realism of the show, and there's stuff that's dramatic. The one scene, this kind of a lighthearted question, the one scene, even though I could accept a lot of, okay, that's for dramatic purposes, the one scene that made me pause and say, hey, wait a minute, was when they, do you remember the one where they stole the Christmas presents from the Master Sergeant, I think? Do you remember that episode?
No, I don't. I don't remember that.
Where they were bringing gifts to the kids at the orphanage and the nun.
Right. That's probably stretching it a bit.
It was kind of like, but it was still a fun scene,
Yeah.
So, and that's what I feel like the show always, at least for me, it always was engaging in some way, you know, like either if it was an unhappy scene or a happy scene or an exciting scene, I just felt engaged. So what about the Vietnamese? I felt it's hard for me to gauge whether they got it historically accurate, but it seemed like they delved quite a bit into the North Vietnamese Viet Cong side.
Yeah.
Are you able to address how you guys collected?
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, you know, part of it is, you know, the research of that is difficult because we don't know what their experience was. You know, we only know it from our side. And, you know, you try and create, as writers and producers, you try and create really well-rounded characters that are not just simply, you know, cutouts of what you think it is, but to try and get into what are people, what's their motivation, what's behind it, what are they feeling and thinking. And, you know, again, I don't mean to just harp on my episode, but one of the things that we had in the episode that I wrote was we had a North Vietnamese soldier who had defected and was their guide. And he's the one who takes them. They find the village where the massacre is. And one of the things that happened is in the episode is that this soldier from North Vietnam, who's now a scout or a guide for us, he and Purcell, who ends up getting into the drugs, they have a confrontation because he's racist and prejudiced against the Vietnamese in general, and specifically the North Vietnamese. And he looks at this guy as, you know, pardon the word gook, you know, he looks at him like he's the enemy. Right. And this actor in the story that I wrote, he ends up taking a bullet that saves Purcell. And when that happens, of course, it changes his perspective, because suddenly this guy who is just one of them and an enemy who had been there to help them and to be a part of their team proves that he's loyal in a way that costs him his life. And Purcell has to take that in. And between that and the massacre, he's then so haunted that he ends up turning to drugs. So we tried to look at, you know, everybody from their perspective. And, you know, the one thing that it's real easy to do, and I think generally a mistake in stories, is to paint people with a broad stroke and to say that, you know, the North Vietnamese were, you know, this evil, you know, horrid people. And, you know, we were the good guys and, you know, on the knights in shining armor. And although, you know, we feel extremely motivated and, you know, by positive, you know, positivity, we did want to bring, you know, democracy and make sure that we were, you know, stopping the stem of communism. But, you know, people are people. And, you know, you got to remember that the person who's, you know, trying to kill you and the person you're trying to kill, they have a family. They have either a mother and father, or they have kids and a wife. And, you know, they're just trying to get their lives on too. And if you don't remember that when you know, then it kind of loses the value of life. So we tried to show both sides to a certain degree. We still feel and still felt like, you know, we had to stay honest to the troops and honor their service. And so we kept that in the forefront always. And we tried, you know, not to step, because it was very obviously, you know, as you know, it's politically, it's a very tumultuous time. And, you know, back here in the States, you know, people were being, the protests were going on, and soldiers returning were treated shabbily and, you know, had a hard time readjusting, and it wasn't fair. You know, they didn't ask to go. This is something that, you know, the government imposed upon them. And it wasn't about, you know, what's right or wrong. It's about duty. And, you know, in a way, Tour of Duty in the title says it, you know, that this is something that they were bound to do because of their service to the country. And, you know, it's not their job to decide where to go and what to do. It's the job of the leaders that, you know, point and say go. And, for a society to turn around and then not take care of their troops back home was, another part of the tragedy. And we touched on that a little bit as well when, we would have, like at one point, Zeke comes back to the States on leave. And I think it actually is supposed to like end his tour and ends up going back for another tour, signing back up. So, we definitely wanted to look at, how do we paint full characters on both sides of the story.
Yeah, it's whenever Zeke or Lieutenant Goldman are on the screen, especially when they're interacting, I just feel like they keep you engaged because they're such well-rounded characters. They're torn between all these different things they have to worry about, and I think the way they express that was done so well in the show.
Thank you. Yeah, we worked on that. We wanted those characters to feel like human beings and to feel real and like, these are the people that and when we hit it, we were real happy about it, for sure.
How about, so when you did episodes that made the U.S. look bad, like your episode, with the massacre, or some people in the U.S., some soldiers doing the wrong thing, how was the audience response to that? Did you get a little more like, hey, don't put down the U.S. military, or was there more, yeah, you're taking care of important things, you're talking about important issues?
Yeah, I think, two things. First of all, we again tried to play both sides of that line. So our guys really are taking the side, and even within the group, we wanted to make it complex. You could have just simply said, oh, our guys come in and they look at this and they straighten everything out, and then the guy who's created the massacres are caught and court-martialed and they go away and it's all done. But that's why we kind of had the North Vietnamese guide. We had Purcell, in conflict with him. We wanted it not to be clean and tidy. We wanted it to be real. So when you looked at that, and, we do have our guys who come into the field and they are horrified by what they see. So, they weren't participating in the massacre. They discover it. And at that point, when they find out who's involved, that soldier has his perspective of why he did what he did. And he ends up eventually having to face the music. So he's court-martialed for it. And that happened later in the season. But so we wanted to show that, yeah, there are these events that happened and they were horrible and they were sad for all those involved, and it ruined people's lives, soldiers' lives. It obviously, killed a lot of people, but that's not everyone. And there are the people that, are trying to do the right thing, trying to be good people, but it was a complex situation. So that even the people that, were there going, this is horrible, this is awful, this is disgusting, oh my God, how could he do that? They were also characters that were going, it's terrible, it's awful, but I understand. I can see how you would get to that place. And we all have that moment of, questioning, what are we doing? Is this right? Did we do the right thing? And, even early on, there talks about, you're in a friendly village and you go into a hut and you open a box and it's filled with explosives, and you and everybody else is blowing the kingdom come. And, that kind of pressure, that you'd never know who's on your side and who isn't. That's, that just, it's real rife with, presenting paranoia into a group. So we wanted to deal with that honestly, but we also wanted our guys to have a certain, watermark that they didn't cross, that they went, this line I don't step over, and that they did their best to bring those who did step over the line back. Yeah. And that was really where our kind of perspective on how do you handle that. And I don't think we got too many people that, really, came back at us with too much upset or anger.
Do you recall if anyone who worked on the show, either actors or, the crew or whatever, did Did anyone have experience having been in the Vietnam War, or have close people they were close to who could,
Well, yeah,
tell them?
yeah. Like I said, our executive producer for the final season was Steve Philip Smith, and he was a Vietnam vet. He was I'm probably gonna mess it up. I think he was a gunner in a helicopter, and he, he was in it deep, and he wrote a book about it, which I have. I have to see if I can find it around here. But he was somebody that had that experience, and then I believe also our technical advisor also, and so we had a couple of them. A guy named Bruce Myers was one of our advisors. Paul Sonor. One of our technical advisors was Michael Christie, and I believe he was a Vietnam vet. He was someone that came from the DoD and was the person that really advised us. But we also, like I said, we followed Steve Smith's guidance as well, and he was there from first season on through becoming the executive producer in the final season. And in the final season, we really changed our direction from, starting off being a show about combat. Then it was the second season. It wasn't about war at all. It was about, the guys having adventures in Vietnam. And then the third season, we really, really tried to get deeper under the belly of what was that experience. And that was all Steve, all Steve's. So he really guided us there, and Michael Christie was a huge help as well.
I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, author of Process to Product, and also a producer and writer on the Vietnam War show Tour of Duty. You can find more information on Brian at brianherskowitz.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Considering the show takes place, 15 to 20 years after the events depicted, do you feel like the younger members of the show, was there anything about that era that surprised them? Like, trying to step back in time, not that far back in time, but I'm curious how different it seemed, between the 80s and the late 60s.
Yeah. It's interesting because probably the biggest difference is we were, I think at that point, probably as close to, a peacetime army as we'd had in, almost forever. I don't think we'd really started to get into, the deep troubles in the Middle East as much. And we really, so the kids that were on the show, and most of them were kids, they didn't have that experience. They didn't grow up with that. They didn't watch the war on television. So that was kind of a different experience for them in general. And I think that they, just trying to embody a soldier, a warrior, in battle and having to face an enemy who's looking to kill you was something that they had to kind of, put on as a suit and see how it fit. And I think, some did better than others in terms of accepting that. But I think all of them, that was a big learning curve for them. That, the service and the sacrifice that you had to make. And, not so much the older guys, not so much, Zeke or, but the young guys that were coming on. I think that they had to deal with, where they were in terms of their perspective of what war meant and having been through that experience.
Considering, so I guess because of the success of Platoon, that kind of spurred interest in this kind of project. I guess my question is, at the time, how much was Hollywood or either TV or movies, were they chasing the Vietnam War to cash in on the sudden interest, or, what was the environment as far as wanting these kind of projects?
That's an interesting question, because there's a strange kind of thing that happens in entertainment, and that stories become cyclical, and there's something kind of just in the water that people are drinking, that they go, okay, now is the time to visit this period. Mm-hmm. And Platoon was kind of the first step in that direction. We hadn't really had a huge successful war-based film, and I don't know how long, but for a while. Mm-hmm. And nor had we really had too many successful films about Vietnam. And part of that was because, it wasn't the most positive experience. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in terms of the individual, but in terms of the vision of what we were doing there. If you go back to, World War II, we had a kind of righteous, a perspective on that. We were in the right, and we were fighting this great evil and Hitler and the Japanese imperialism, and we were the good guys, and we wore the white hats, and we won. And in Vietnam, it was a little more difficult to kind of nail down what were we doing there, what was our goal, and then we kind of got out of it without winning. Mm-hmm. And it made that period of time, fascinating. But, a lot of people, when it was still a fresh wound, didn't want to revisit. Mm-hmm. But it comes that every 20 or 30 years, people, start to look back and become nostalgic about a certain time period. So in a way, that time period, it was just its time. Mm-hmm. And, China Beach, Platoon, and then there were, after that, quite a few other really well done Vietnam War films. Mm-hmm. It was time for that story to be investigated, for us to kind of go back. And in a way, I find that kind of thing can be cathartic, mm-hmm. that it allows an audience, and particularly the people that had, gone through it, it allows them to either go, oh, that's crap, that never happened, or to go, yeah, somebody really realized what I had gone through and captured it, and I can now kind of talk about it and be a part of it. And I think that's part of what the experience is when you go back to these time periods. I mean, right now I'm hearing from, people in the industry that, the 1990s are the period pieces that are being looked at now. That's the time period people want to do television, not the 60s, 70s, 80s, but for some reason the 1990s. Yeah. And it does kind of happen. One year there were 3 movies about asteroids hitting the Earth. Yeah. It's like, came out within a month of each other. So there is a time when, it's not necessarily, oh, that succeeded, now we want to piggyback on that, although there are people that do that. Mm-hmm. It's really more about, it's now that period of time is something that is clearly of interest to people, and there's something about it that we wanted to explore about that experience, and we wanted to have some sort of either catharsis or closure to the way that we went through that time period.
Mm-hmm. I recall, oddly, this might be a strange show to sort of be exposed to the Vietnam War, but Magnum PI, even though it wasn't about the Vietnam War, the main characters, the original show, they were Vietnam War vets, and there were little, I forget specifics, but there were little things that in that show, and when I was a little kid, I'm like, what is this Vietnam War that, they keep referencing?
Keep talking about it, yeah.
So it's kind of strange to think that it seems like what is that, like 8 or 9 years, 10 years after the war, they started, you have this super popular show touching on it.
Right. Right.
So I don't know if you have a comment. That was just sort of an aside.
I mean, part of that is, again, it was a part of the truth of our history. Mm-hmm. You can't get away from the fact that we were in Vietnam. You can't get away from the fact that we had men that were serving and dying overseas. You can't get away from the fact that it was an unpopular war. Not that any war should be popular, but mm-hmm. it was an unpopular war from a political standpoint. Mm-hmm. And it was controversial. So it was absolutely natural and right that there would be characters that had that background, because that's where we were as a society. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things you mentioned about the series is that the characters were, vets, but they did touch on it, and it certainly kind of gave the actors and the characters a perspective and a way of kind of, I guess, validating their skills and their craft. But it wasn't the meat and potatoes of the show. You know, it was kind of like, it was backstory, but it wasn't really, that wasn't what the show is about. Mm-hmm. They would once in a while revisit it or touch on it, but that, you know, it wasn't the main meal because we weren't ready as a country. We weren't ready to kind of take a look at, you know, what we did wrong and what we did right.
For Tour of Duty, were there any, do you know of any people, and you don't have to name names, who just felt like they couldn't deal with the subject matter and either didn't get involved with the project or dropped out because it was maybe too much for them? Or,
you know, not specifically. We had early on, and the show, like again, the show went through a lot of different kind of permutations. It started the first season, the first few episodes were all shot in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. You know, and in fact, I think maybe the entire first season was shot in Hawaii. And the producer at the time, the line producer, was a guy named Ronald Schwery, and Ron was a producer for Robert Redford and had won an Academy Award for Ordinary People as a producer. So he was kind of this really tough Banty Rooster guy, and you know, he would, you know, tell the guys, you know, you can't do any overtime, and you know, we're going to keep an eye on you. And he said to them, you know, we have a bullet with every one of your names on it. Nobody knows who you are. You know, we can lose you tomorrow, so you know, act right. and so he kind of tried to put the fear of God in him. He left after the first season, and we had one actor who shall remain nameless, who came to us and said, I'm not happy with my storylines. And it wasn't about the depiction. It wasn't about, you know, what his perspective was. It was simply, he didn't feel like he was having enough to do. And he said, so either kill me off or give me more to do. And the producers at the time chose to kill him off. So he left the show and we brought someone else on. And, you know, we tried not to do that too much. We liked our guys. We wanted to keep them together. You know, we would have actors that would leave, but I can't think of anyone who was uncomfortable with the storylines or with the, you know, with the direction we took the stories in. You know, I mentioned that Carl Weathers came into the show, and, you know, we started talking to him about, you know, what he wanted from the show, what he would like to do, what he would like to see, because he was, you know, he's brought in as kind of a bigger name to help, you know, stunt cast, bring in more of an audience. And, you know, some of his suggestions we tried to integrate into the series. And that's how we ended up with a racially mixed child and a Vietnamese wife, and, you know, allowed us to get into that and how that child was treated both by the Americans and by the Vietnamese, and, you know, being treated as an outcast by both sides. And, you know, we wanted to hit subjects like that. I never remember anybody approaching us and saying, I'm not comfortable with doing this, or that's not, that's going too far. We just didn't have it, except for the network. The network would stop us at a certain point because they had censorship, and they would come back and say, oh yeah, no, you can't do that, but you can do this. And we would change based on that. Interesting.
Yeah, I thought the Carl Weathers storyline was really great to see, especially since I've lived around a lot of sort of interracial children of couples, you know, American soldiers and Southeast Asian women, you know, because of the war.
Right.
So I thought that was a very good storyline to introduce. I don't know if it was as strong then as I feel like it is now, but yeah, I just want to commend whoever decided to do that.
Well, I think that was me, actually.
Oh, really?
I'm sure I'm going to get a call from somebody. No, you idiot, that was me. But I think, because I had a meeting with Carl and a couple of the other producers, writers, and he was talking about some experiences he had with, you know, with racism and with, you know, people kind of being racist against his child. And we talked about that and wanting to integrate that into the show. And it was actually, I think, my episode where they kind of started to really hit on that. and cast a little boy and everything. It was a storyline that we didn't do a whole lot with, but it was part of this idea of making a character full and real and having a roundness to them. And again, I think a lot of times there were guys that went over to Vietnam and they would fall in love and they would, find a woman and say, this is who I want to end up with. So there were kids that came out of those couplings, and, you have to kind of look at it and say, did we give this the proper amount of time? And did we show it like it was, or did we, gloss it too much or too little? Mm-hmm. I think that was one that we went on.
So one of the interesting things that storyline made me think of is, the character shows a great deal of sympathy for the Vietnamese people. And then you find out he has a Vietnamese wife. So then the question is, well, does he care? Is he really like this great magnanimous person who loves all people? Or is it just sort of a more selfish interest where he's married into the Vietnamese culture? Or is that even distinguishable? Does it matter? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's part of the complexities of the story, and trying, and you work with the actors, you work with the producers, you work with the writers to kind of, hash that out and decide where do you stand? And we tried to make Carl's, a strong leader and somebody who was even-handed and fair, and somebody who understood the local culture. So that was part of, his backstory and why he was as magnanimous and as even-handed as he was. But he also had a very clear, position where he had to go and what he had to do as a soldier. So there was a very strong delineation between, his wife as a Vietnamese woman, his child, and the job that he had to do against the North Vietnamese. And he kept that compartmentalized as a character. And that was important to us because it is, we all have personal lives that, kind of intrude on our business lives. And you have to look at it and say, what's too much and what's too little.
I notice, and I don't want this question to sound like as though I'm accusatory but, a lot of I think a lot of the storylines revolved around protecting children. Is that sort of just an easy way to get the audience sympathetic to their plight, or why did you have focus on children at times?
Well, we didn't do it that often. I think you mentioned an episode where they, were supposed to take presents one place and they ended up taking them to an orphanage. And I looked it up. It was called Green Christmas. Right. And, those kind of stories, yeah, they certainly pluck at the heartstrings. But it's about, does this exist in our universe of the story? Is this something that might happen, and is this the way it would happen? And sometimes, like I said, sometimes we went beyond that, or either too far or too short, but we tried to hit the mark. And audiences relate to family, and they relate to children, they relate to the trials and the tribulations that people go through. And one of the sad truths about war is that war leaves people orphans. And it, and in Vietnam, we had that, we were involved in creating this part of that world where, a lot of kids were left without a mother, without a father, and they have to be taken care of. And it's just, that's just a sad truth. And in that, there are, orphanages, and there were soldiers that wanted to help out, and they would go there and they would bring candy, or they'd bring toys, or they would try and be of some assistance to the people that were suffering. And, that's one of the kind of, I think, one of the real positive sides that aren't really highlighted when you talk about war, are the things that we try to do that, and when I say we, I'm talking about the individual who goes, I can do something for the people around me. And we have people that are good-hearted that are in those positions, regardless of what their, what their politics are or what's going on around them. And I think that's something that, we lose sight of. So that's part of what it is. And then the other part is just, commerce. People relate to saving kids, being good with kids, and it draws people in.
So with the episode you wrote, obviously with the massacre, you show some dead children. Did the censors have, I mean, that's pretty strong at the time. Was that kind of risky to do, or was that acceptable to the network?
No, I don't think they didn't balk at that. In fact, like I said, the biggest thing that I remember them having trouble with was that we wanted Purcell, based on that episode, to start shooting heroin. And they fought us tooth and nail, and we finally got a compromise with that. I don't know why they didn't question, that it was, that there were children also. I think, that we were trying to kind of parallel what happened at My Lai, and that it was the entire village. I think they accepted that. And, that's a real tough, it's a tough reality if you accept it as reality. And we wanted to handle it with some care. We wanted to handle it with some aplomb, and we tried to make it a horrendous act, somewhat not palatable, but understandable. And that was really the goal, was so that you could sit back and go, that was, atrocious. It was, it was absolutely horrendous, but we can see, how people are put into this, pressure cooker, and this is what the results are. And that comes back to, who's leading the band? Where are we in this world, and what are we doing to our warriors, to our soldiers?
So now, just to talk about sort of changes you've seen in writing or production or approaches to, say, action or adventure, and just to note, like IMDb shows a few projects you were involved with, the Wolverine War. What have you seen any changes as far as approaches or how violence and that sort of thing is presented?
Well, yeah. Yeah, on a couple of different levels. First of all, it wasn't that long ago that there were no real CGI graphics in films. It wasn't that long ago. Now, if you have enough money, you can do virtually anything. You can get as graphic or as inventive as you want to. Christopher Nolan can take cities and turn them upside down and make them Escher paintings. You can have John Wick, slaughtering people in any number of ways. You can have, so there's all kinds of things that you can do that, weren't possible 20 years ago in terms of filmmaking. And again, it's expensive to do that kind of thing, but it allows us to really kind of push the envelope. And the violence in action has kind of gone in two different directions. It's increased in some ways. You see a lot more violence. Like I said, you look at a John Wick, his body count, I can't even imagine if you start looking at how many people did he do away with it. So, those shows, those films, and there are tons of that kind of movie, those films that have very kind of graphic violence, and the amount of blood and the amount of, killing and how people are killed, that really has, kind of extended. And some of it's entertaining. There was a movie of the week, actually, not too long ago, on Netflix, that Chris Hemsworth was in. And it was basically a mercenary John Wick. A guy goes to save a kid who's been kidnapped, and he has to go through this gauntlet to try and get the kid to safety. And it was just killing one person after another after another. And you're seeing more and more of that kind of story. And to me, I don't have a problem with the violence if the story's good. If I understand the characters and where they're coming from and the motivation. And I think generally, the films that people support do that pretty well. They do. And then on the other side of it, I think we also have a push, to kind of minimize violence and make it a little more cartoon-like. And you look at films like Sin City, for example, where extremely graphic and extremely violent, but a cartoon. It was a graphic novel, and it looked like a graphic novel on screen. So it really kind of depends on, what your tastes are, but it has increased. And the other thing is that, we've the pace of films have changed dramatically, and that came about because we're now we're a TikTok nation. We want our gratification quick, and we want to get there, know what's going on, get out, have a happy ending, and go home. And so you're seeing a lot more films jumping right into it. Deadpool, which one of my favorite movies of the last couple of years, and the sequel as well. You don't get much more graphic violence, with he's torn in two, and his legs are thrown one way and his head the other, and blown up, and every other way that he can be destroyed. But the story was great, and the characters are terrific, and you follow that and you enjoy it. And if you're not into violence, you don't see it, you don't watch it. But if you do, if you're okay with it, you go along with it. So the biggest change has been the pace of films, for my 2 cents worth, and the ability to do things like, wouldn't be able to have a CGI character pick up Deadpool and rip him in two and throw his body in 2 different directions 20 years ago. We couldn't do it.
Right.
Now we can. Should we? Maybe, but we can. So that's the biggest difference I see.
Do you have any experience with writing for video games?
I don't actually, although I have. I've done a little bit of voice acting, and I played a captain in the what was it? Medal of Honor Airborne. Was it? So that was as close to writing a video game as I've come. My daughter writes video games. She has one out called Monster Prom.
Okay. And
they're about to do the sequel on that. But yeah, I've never written for video games. I'd be fascinated to try, because when you write for a video game, depending on what kind of game it is, whether it's there's some that are pretty simple, but you have to have kind of a spider web of choices that a character makes, and then what happens and how they can get back to the place that you need them to get back to. So it's a very, where a screenplay you might write, 110, 120 pages, you probably, for the same amount of entertainment, you probably have to write, 10 times that amount to have a 2-hour game, because it's just, you have so many variables, and you have to think about, well, if he turns left instead of right, what happens? If he goes straight instead of backwards, what happens? If he uses that gun instead of this, what happens? If he says this line instead of that? And all of that goes into the mix and has an effect on character and on the story and on the direction the story takes.
And I asked that because obviously you probably know, there's some super popular military-themed games of all kinds out, with complex storylines, and they're part of military entertainment,
for sure.
And I'm looking at the connection between stuff like Tour of Duty, all the way to what people are consuming now. And you have a lot of guys in the military who on tour, on a deployment in a war zone, will come home,
games.
And just sit down and play war games. And it's like, it's the question is, what's going on? Does it mean anything? Does it not mean anything?
That's a really good question. I haven't really analyzed, why someone who is living it would also want to play it. To me, the one of the great draws of computer gaming is I get to experience a world that I don't have any risk in, so I can, jump behind the wheel of a car and get into a race car and not have to worry if I crash. I can, go on a mission, as a secret agent and not have to worry about being assassinated. So those are the things that are kind of fun to, kind of role play in that instance. But I also think that those games, they are immersive. So you really do kind of become those characters, and you start to feel like you're a part of that universe. And I suspect that, when you're in the military and you're deployed in a place where the tension is high, that's a way of, kind of getting, not necessarily because it's a military game, but because of the immersion that it allows you. And because you've done the military, you are already kind of skilled in that way of thinking, that it allows you to then kind of let go of the tension and really, it's almost like a little mini vacation that you get to go in and be the same guy you are in life, but without any risk. And that I think is one of the big, kind of attractions to it. And to me, it's kind of, I have a what I call the roller coaster theory, which is, people love roller coasters because there's this feeling when you're on a roller coaster that you are going to die. Mm-hmm. And then you don't die. So it's the roller coaster effect is this, people that want to have that adrenaline rush without risking their lives. Mm-hmm. And yet because your fight or flight, response is, oh my God, I'm going to die. I've got to get out of here. I've got to save myself. And then you survive and you become a survivor and you walk off going, oh, that was great. What a rush. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, appeals to people in going into these games. They particularly, now we're getting to a place where virtual reality and augmented reality is getting close enough to where your experience is going to be closer and closer to reality. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to find that, right now they're using it for PTSD. Mm-hmm. Using virtual reality. And I've talked to psychiatrists about this and the way that they will take people that have come back from war and have had horrible experiences and help them through their PTSD through virtual reality and playing games and doing things, because what they found is that memory is a little bit like a filing cabinet. Mm-hmm. And that, the memories that are fresh, they kind of haunt you. And as you start to get new memories, it can push those memories back down. But when you have PTSD, those memories stay close to the surface. So they have to try and find a way to put other things in front of them. And the PTSD, doing this kind of virtual reality sessions, they found has helped quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And, that brings up a whole nother thing about, well, what happens if could you implant false memories in a child, for example? Mm. And, there's going to be all kinds of ethical questions that come around when we have an entertainment that feels so real that you don't know what was real and what wasn't.
Interesting. That's
it's deep.
Yeah. Let me ask you, just to touch on your screenwriting book, just to kind of ask a question to help plug it. Let's say someone listening to this, let's say there's someone who's, maybe they've been to war and they want to write about their experiences, write a screenplay or whatever about something they're familiar with, a war subject. Is there stuff in the book that can talk to how they can process what they have into something that can be pushed and sold to someone?
100%. The book, my background, when I started working with Tour of Duty was about the same time I started writing professionally for film and television. I had a movie that came out in between the first and second season, and then I started writing for the show in the third season. And that really set me on the path of working as a writer, producer, and director. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I started teaching screenwriting. And I was teaching initially at UCLA, and a place called Writers Boot Camp in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I did that for about 13, 14 years. And the last 14 years I've been teaching for Boston University in Los Angeles. They have a program that is a satellite of the Boston University campus. And when I was working at UCLA, my classes were all online. So everything that I was teaching, I had to write down because it was all, they had to get the materials, read it, and then they would do the writing. And because of that, I started looking at it and going, I think I have a book here. And I wanted to put together something because there are a few different books for writers that are excellent books, and I recommend them highly. One is Sid Field called Screenplay, and it's just a real simple, here's a 3-act structure for films, and a lot of films have this 3-act structure. And then there's also the Hero's Journey, A Hero with 1,000 Faces by a guy named Joseph Campbell, mm-hmm. Which is more about general storytelling. But one thing that there wasn't a lot of is, how do you do that without having kind of a straitjacket that tells you, okay, do this on page 1 and this on page 2 and this on page 5. I wanted to give the writers more freedom than that, but still give them a structure that allow them to kind of go from, I don't know what I want to do. I have an idea, but I don't know how to write it. How do I start it? How how do I expand it? How do I make it into a screenplay? And then how do I fix it if there are problems with it? And I wanted to do that kind of nuts to suit. And I did. That was the book that I came up with. And that's why it's called Process to Product. And that actually came out of my martial arts training, where I started off, as a young kid in martial arts. And I found that whenever I would compete, if I felt like I had to win, I would get real tight, and I would ultimately, not have a great day. And if I wasn't thinking about winning, but thinking about the process of what I had to do, how I wanted to get my grip, how I wanted to step, how I wanted to throw, how I'd wanted to end the match, what I was going to do if they turned to the right, those kind of things, that I did very well and succeeded. So that was a really interesting lesson for me. And I started to apply that to the idea, don't think about, the greatest script that anyone's ever written. Don't think about, I'm going to have a huge audience. Don't think about, it's going to win Academy Awards. What you want to think about is, who are the people? Why are they thinking the way they're thinking? What are they doing? Where are they going? And what is the story? And if you do that, if you work on the process and you're true to it, the product will be successful. And that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of what the book is about.
Have you had students who were military veterans? Have you taught any? Do you recall?
I have, and but I couldn't off the top of my head even tell you, what branch they were in. In the 30 plus years I've been doing this, I've taught hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, and I've had students from all over the world and all ages. So, I've had several people that have had military training, have brought that into their work, but I can't remember anyone who specifically wanted to do a story about their experiences in battle or in war. And not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But I think that's because, great stories come from great conflict. And there's probably no greater conflict than we find in the middle of a war. Like one of the great movies this year was 1917. I don't know if you saw it, but, very interesting film. Did you see it? Not yet, no. Not yet. Okay. So it has a fascinating way of doing the production, and it really just follows two guys through their mission to warn troops at the front line in World War I. When they didn't have cell phones and you couldn't wire ahead. So it's a really fascinating story, and beautifully told and beautifully done, and very, very, very simple. And that's one of the fascinating things about putting people in war. It's one of the most heightened conflicts that you can possibly imagine. And when you put people in that kind of situation, extraordinary things happen.
It's interesting. What are you familiar with the movie? It's with Kevin Bacon. It's Something Chance. Why am I forgetting? It's a great film. It's a military film, but it's literally him accompanying a deceased veteran back to his hometown. So as you were talking, and I bring it up because this movie is almost universal. I'd say everyone I've talked to, it's universally loved as a film about basically the home front. This character taking chance. It's a TV movie. Came out in 2009. I don't think it really has any actual military action. It's literally this guy, he accompanies this 19-year-old Marine's remains back to his hometown. And it's such a simple story, and you wouldn't think something so simple could create such emotional tension, and yet it does.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a long history of taking that kind of story. There was the one with Jane Fonda, John Voight, where he's a wounded warrior and she falls in love with him, and I think she won an Academy, or one of them won an Academy Award for it. I have to look that one up too because I can't remember the name. But there are, going back even to the earliest days of the cinema after World War II, there were stories about, soldiers returning from war and having to deal with both what they went through and trying to rebuild their lives. And it's, one of the things that's, kind of fascinating and somewhat a shame is that we keep having that same history repeat itself where, we see our soldiers, our military who have served us and served the country coming back, and either they're, having issues with health, they're having issues with mental health, having difficulty finding jobs, those kind of things that have to be addressed. And, we've over the years historically, that's been a difficult subject for us to tackle. And it's something that we really have to, I think, really have to look at, as we put men in harm's way and ask them to take the ultimate, chance for us, that we have to do a little bit more for them back home. And the adjustment and the readjustment of people coming back is an important part of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. All right. So where can people find you on the web? Do you have social media, web page?
It's almost hard not to find me on the web. I'm almost everywhere on the web. I have a website, which is, my name. It's www.brianherskowitz.com. I'm also the CCO of a film finance company that's a startup. I can be found there it's called Crypto Film Fund. So the www.cryptofilmfund.com. I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to reach me if you're interested in connecting with me. And feel free to say that you heard me on the show and say hi. I'd love to talk to you. And those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
So I'll spell your name for listeners.
Sure, because it's a long one. It's HERSKOWITZ, and it's Brian with an I. So it's BrianHerskowitz.com.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I certainly do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, right now Tour of Duty is back on the air, and it's on Icon TV, I think it is. And if you haven't seen the show and you're interested in it, check it out. It's a good show. It's just 3 seasons. I think you can probably binge watch it pretty quickly, and you can make your own judgment about whether you think it captured the experience of the soldiers. And again, for me, I felt like we were just hitting our stride in the 3rd season, and I would love for it to go further. But that's where you can find Tour of Duty now, and I hope that the audience that loves it will come back and love it again. And those people that haven't seen it, I hope they find it.
Do you know, are they the one big controversy? Are they airing it with the original music, or is it with the? Oh no.
So yeah, one of the things that happened is when we first did the show, and I was in charge a lot in finding the music. We had "Paint It Black" by the Rolling Stones was our opening song, and we had that for every year that we were in first run. But when we went into syndication, as we were doing reruns and into syndication, they didn't want to pay the money for Painted Black. So we had a wonderful composer named Joseph Conlon, and Joe did the score for the opening credits to replace Painted Black. But I do miss that song. It would have been nice to have. But yeah, I think the music that was like in the show itself when we had music playing, I think that's probably still there. And we had a lot of the songs from the 60s. And at that time, in the late 80s and early 90s, you could still get away with hiring a sound-alike group, as long as they didn't sound exactly like who you were trying to copy. Yeah. And then that went away very, very shortly thereafter, because I think Bette Midler complained about or sued somebody because they did a commercial that sounded like her. Yeah. And they kind of said, okay, you can't do that anymore. But we had some great music in the show, and I hope it's still there. I have to go check it out.
Now, did you choose Painted Black as the opening song?
No, that was done before, and it was actually done because I believe because it was used in Platoon, I think is where they had it. Either Platoon or in Apocalypse Now, I can't remember, but one of the two films had it in the movie, and they wanted to have that same feel.
Because it's one of my favorite songs, and it's because it opened Tour of Duty each episode.
Yeah,
and I can't.
Great. It was we cut the opening credits to the song, and it really was. It got you pumped up for the episodes, I thought.
Oh yeah, I can't. Whenever I hear the song on the radio, I think about the show.
Me too. Same, I'm right behind you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.